Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the lore they never wanted you to know.
The sky bled colors that had no names on the day I realized we would never leave. I had been a cartographer once. In my previous life, the life before the warp storm caught our pilgrim fleet and spat us out into this place where reality wept and physics begged for mercy. My name was Valen Christos, though I'm not certain that name still belongs to me, or if names mean anything at all when the ground beneath your feet remembers being something else, when it whispers its old configurations to you in dreams that never quite end even after you wake. We called the settlement New Providence, which tells you everything about our desperation and nothing about our chances. 347 souls when we crashed. I've stopped counting the living. The transport had been called the Blessed Endurance, a pilgrim vessel 3 centuries old, carrying faithful toward the shrine worlds of the Caridian expanse. I had signed aboard as a contracted cartographer, meant to help chart our route through the safer warp channels, to verify ancient star charts against newer astropathic readings. My quarters had been a 2-meter cube near the cartography chamber, my possessions limited to what could fit in a standard-issue locker, my expectations calibrated to 6 months of tedious work, followed by a stipend large enough to clear my family's debt on our Manufactorum hab level back on Griffon V. The warp journey was supposed to take 4 weeks. On the 18th day, the Geller field fluctuated just a microsecond, the tech priests said, a momentary ripple in the protective bubble that kept the Imperium from flooding into our ship. 18 days, 18 seconds, 18 years. Time meant nothing in the warp, but consequences meant everything. I remember the screaming started before anyone understood why. The lower decks reported pressure anomalies, then temperature inversions, then things that couldn't have been manifesting in the corridors. The ship's navigator, a woman I'd glimpsed only once through her chamber's viewing portal, her third eye wrapped in sanctified bandages, began speaking in tongues no human throat should produce. The captain, a decorated voidmaster with 40 years of service, ordered an emergency translation back to real space. We dropped out of the warp like a stone thrown from a great height, our Geller field sputtering and dying, our engines screaming protests in languages that predated Gothic, our hull breaching in 17 places simultaneously, as if something with 17 hands had decided to open us like a ripe fruit. The Blessed Endurance made planetfall with all the grace of a condemned man's corpse, crashing into what looked like a desert of black glass under a sky that shifted between purple and a sickly yellow-green that made your teeth ache to witness. I survived because I was in the cartography chamber when we hit, strapped into my workstation chair, surrounded by cogitators and autoquills and star charts that burst into flames from the impact heat. The chamber was deep in the ship's interior, protected by layers of bulkhead and blessing-inscribed adamantium. Half the pilgrims died in the crash. Another third died in the first week from injuries, from infections that smelled like burning copper and spread faster than any disease I'd learned about in Skolum. The rest of us, those of us who could still be called us in any meaningful sense, gathered what supplies remained uncontaminated and began the work of survival. We established New Providence in the shadow of the crashed ship's broken spine, using intact hull sections as shelters, rationing the food synthesizers that still functioned, praying to the Emperor for deliverance that, in our hearts, we already knew would never come. The first thing you learn on a demon world is that consistency is a lie. The black glass desert we'd crashed into was, 3 days later, a forest of crystalline trees that sang in frequencies that made your bones resonate uncomfortably. Those trees were gone a week after that, replaced by a plain of ash that went on forever in every direction, though forever lasted only until the next morning when we woke to find ourselves surrounded by an ocean of oil that burned but was never consumed, its flames casting no heat, its smoke forming shapes that watched us with too many eyes. The second thing you learn is that the demon world we never learned its name, if it had one, if naming conventions even applied to places that existed more in concept than in reality. The world itself was alive, or something adjacent to alive, something that breathed with rhythms that didn't match any cycle you could measure, something that wanted things from us we didn't understand how to give. Father Matthias, our priest, tried to maintain the rituals. He held services every day, his voice cracking as he recited the litanies of protection, the prayers against darkness, the canticles of the Emperor's light. The first month, people came. They needed the structure, needed the familiar words, needed to believe that faith alone could shield them from what we saw when we closed our eyes, from the dreams that felt more real than waking. The second month, attendance dropped. People were changing. Not all at once, not obviously, but in small ways that accumulated like interest on a debt you could never repay. Marcus, who'd been a tech acolyte on the ship, began speaking with two voices simultaneously, one explaining perfectly reasonable technical details, the other whispering sums that added up to impossible numbers. Yelena, a young mother whose child had died in the crash, started seeing her daughter in reflections, but never in mirrors, only in still water, in polished metal, in the glassy surface of the rocks that sometimes appeared overnight. The daughter would wave, Yelena would wave back. None of us mentioned that the daughter looked wrong, that her proportions shifted each time, that sometimes she had too many fingers and sometimes too few. I tried to do what I was trained for. I attempted to map our surroundings, to create some sense of stability through documentation. My cartography tools were mostly destroyed, but I'd salvaged some autoquills, some parchment, some basic measurement equipment. Every morning, I would venture out from New Providence, never farther than I could see the ship's wreckage, and I would take readings. Elevation, distance to landmarks, angular measurements of the sky, though the sky here had features that shouldn't exist. Angles that made your instruments give readings in negative numbers or in expressions of pure concept rather than numerical value. I would return and update my maps, carefully inking in the features I'd observed, cross-referencing them with previous surveys. The maps never matched. A mountain range I'd documented the previous week would be gone, replaced by a chasm that my instruments claimed was both infinitely deep and exactly 17 meters, both measurements being simultaneously true. The rivers flowed upward sometimes. The forests, when there were forests, had trees whose roots descended into darkness that wasn't absence of light but presence of something else, something that had weight and texture and intention. By the third month, Father Matthias stopped holding services. Not because he'd lost faith, if anything. His faith had intensified to a degree that frightened the rest of us, but because something had happened during the previous night's Vespers. He'd been mid-prayer, invoking the Emperor's protection, when the words had started to change. Not his words, he insisted later, but the words themselves, the sacred text rewriting itself as he spoke, so that "deliver us from evil" became "deliver us to knowing," and "hallowed be thy name," transformed into "hollow be thy name." And he couldn't stop, couldn't control his own voice, couldn't do anything but speak these new wrong prayers, while the congregation watched in horror, and something in the darkness outside the makeshift chapel laughed, with a sound like breaking glass. Afterward, Matthias locked himself in his shelter. We'd hear him through the walls, reciting scripture backward, forward, in languages he shouldn't know, his voice never stopping, never resting, as if silence would allow something to slip in through the gaps. The food situation became critical around month 4. The synthesizers were failing, not from mechanical breakdown but from what I can only describe as philosophical disagreement with their purpose. They'd produce rations that looked correct, smelled correct, but tasted like memories, like your first kiss, like childhood fear, like the moment you learned someone you loved had died. Eating became an exercise in dissociation, in forcing your mind to separate from the act of consumption, to not think about the fact that you were ingesting conceptual matter shaped into something approximating nutrition. Some people couldn't do it. They starved, their bodies wasting away while their minds remained perfectly aware, perfectly trapped in the prison of their failing flesh. We burned the bodies at first, proper cremation as the ecclesiarchy demanded, but fire behaved differently here. The smoke would coalesce into shapes that moved with purpose, that would circle the settlement at night, whispering in the voices of the deceased, offering advice that seemed helpful until you realized it was leading you toward decisions that would, with mathematical certainty, result in your own dissolution. I had been on this world, I still called it a world, though that term felt increasingly inadequate for approximately 6 months when I met the thing that wore Sergeant Corvus's face. Corvus had been one of the ship's armsmen, a veteran of the Imperial Guard before he'd taken service on the Blessed Endurance. He'd survived the crash, had been instrumental in establishing New Providence's defensive perimeter, had been the one who organized our rationing system and work rotations. 3 weeks prior, he'd gone missing during a scavenging expedition to the ship's wreckage. We'd searched, found nothing, assumed he'd been taken by one of the things that prowled the edges of our perception. The entities we glimpsed from the corners of our eyes, but never directly, never fully, never in a way that allowed us to confirm they were real rather than mass hallucination brought on by this place's reality-eroding nature. Then he returned, walking out of the oil ocean that shouldn't have been there, because yesterday this area had been an ice field, and tomorrow would probably be something else entirely. He walked across the burning liquid, his boots neither wet nor aflame, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He looked exactly like Corvus, every scar in the right place, every mannerism correct. His voice, when he spoke, carried the same rough edges from years of shouting orders over battlefield noise. "I know where we can find real food," he said, addressing the dozen or so people who'd been on watch. "I found something out there, something the ship's sensors couldn't have detected. A structure, pre-imperial, maybe, or post-imperial. Time's funny here. Either way, there's food there, real food, from before. I wasn't there when he made this announcement, but I heard about it immediately because in a settlement of fewer than 200 people, information spreads faster than disease. By the time I arrived, an argument had erupted. Half the survivors wanted to follow Corvus, wanted to believe that salvation could still be found in this hell. The other half sensed something wrong, some uncanny valley wrongness in the man's return, some subtle indication that the thing wearing Corvus's face wasn't entirely Corvus anymore. I studied him from across the clearing that served as our central gathering space, observing with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years noting minute details for cartographic purposes. He looked right, moved right, spoke right. But his shadow was wrong. It moved a half-second out of sync with his body, and it had too many fingers. And when he wasn't looking directly at you, his eyes reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't, with colors that bent perception and made you uncertain whether you'd actually seen anything wrong at all. The settlement split. 73 people followed Corvus into the shifting landscape, convinced that any chance was better than slow starvation and madness. The rest of us stayed, partly from caution, partly from a growing realization that movement here was dangerous, that this world rewarded stillness, that those who traveled far from the ship's wreckage tended to return changed or not at all. I watched them leave, disappearing into a region that my instruments claimed was simultaneously forest and desert and ocean, all 3 states existing in superposition until observed. They carried what supplies they could salvage, their faces showing a mixture of hope and desperation that, in retrospect, was the most human thing I'd seen in months. That was the last time I saw any of them unchanged. Some never returned. Others came back over the following weeks. But they were different. Not obviously, not in ways you could point to and say, this is wrong, but different nonetheless, in small accumulated ways that added up to a fundamental transformation of what they were. I threw myself into mapping with renewed intensity after the Corvus expedition. It was a futile exercise, a kind of ritual behavior that I performed because the alternative was confronting the magnitude of our abandonment, our absolute isolation in a place that shouldn't exist, where we were less than prisoners because prisoners have captors who acknowledge their existence, while we had only the indifferent malevolence of a reality that digested us slowly, incorporating us into itself through processes we couldn't comprehend. My maps grew increasingly abstract. I abandoned attempts at accurate representation and began mapping concepts instead, regions of high fear, areas where time moved differently, zones where the laws of thermodynamics were more like suggestions than rules. I used colors that weren't quite colors, symbols that represented feelings rather than features, measurement units I invented because traditional meters and kilometers failed to capture the essential wrongness of what I was trying to document. Month 7 brought the first flowers. They erupted from the ground overnight, impossibly large blooms the size of hab units, petals that reflected your face but aged or youth-ended it by random intervals, so you might see yourself as a child in one petal and as an ancient corpse in another. And the center of each flower contained what looked like eyes. Hundreds of them, all different species, all blinking in rhythms that almost but didn't quite sync with your heartbeat. They sang, low, subsonic harmonics that you felt in your bones before you heard them with your ears, songs that had structure and grammar and meaning that your mind couldn't quite grasp, but your body understood at some deep cellular level. People who stayed near the flowers too long began to change. Their skin would take on textures bark-like, then crystalline, then something between liquid and solid that defied classification. Their eyes would gain additional pupils. Their voices would harmonize with the flower's song until you couldn't tell where the person ended and the music began. Father Matthias emerged from his shelter during the flower bloom. He looked thin, emaciated, his eyes sunken but burning with terrible clarity. He walked among the flowers, touching them, speaking to them in languages I didn't recognize, languages that hurt to hear, that made your teeth vibrate and your vision blur at the edges. He began to preach again, but not the liturgies of the Imperial Creed, not the prayers we'd all learned in Scholomon Church and the million small rituals that held Imperial society together. These were new prayers, or perhaps very old prayers, words that tasted like copper when you heard them, that left after-images in your mind, that explained things about the nature of reality that you'd been happier not knowing. Some people listened. Some people followed him when he walked out into the flower fields, when he laid down among the blooms and let them grow over him, through him, until he was part of the garden and the garden was part of him, until Father Matthias and the flowers and the singing all became one thing, one entity that still spoke with his voice but said things that made the sky shudder and weep. I documented it all in my maps, creating visual records of transformation, of the slow dissolution of everything we'd been into everything this world wanted us to become. My hands shook as I drew, but I couldn't stop. The act of mapping had become my anchor, my last connection to the person I'd been, to the cartographer who'd thought he understood how space worked, how reality functioned, how cause and effect were linear processes you could measure and predict. Every line I drew was a lie. Every symbol I used was inadequate. Every map I completed was obsolete before the ink dried. But I kept drawing, kept documenting, kept trying to impose order on chaos that was too fundamental, too essential, too absolute to ever be contained by human concepts of organization. The thing that had been Marcus approached me on day 207 I'd kept count in tally marks scratched into my shelter's wall. Though I suspected time here didn't flow the same way it did in real space, that my 207 days might have been years or minutes or centuries depending on which framework of reference you used. Marcus spoke in harmony with himself now, three distinct voices sharing one throat, discussing engineering principles and theological paradoxes and mathematical impossibilities simultaneously, the three conversations weaving together into a strange coherence that made terrible sense if you listened long enough. "Your maps are beautiful," he said, all three voices in agreement for once. "But you're mapping the wrong things. You're documenting the surface, the exterior, the shallow water where light still penetrates. You need to map the depths, the places where this world touches other worlds, the thin places where reality is so worn down that you can see through it to what lies beneath. I asked him what he meant. I shouldn't have. Some questions, once asked, demand answers, and answers on this world came with costs you couldn't calculate until after you'd paid them. Marcus smiled, his mouth stretching wider than mouths should, revealing teeth that weren't quite teeth, weren't quite anything else either, and he took my hand. His touch was wrong, simultaneously too hot and too cold, somehow occurring in more dimensions than three, as if his fingers existed partially in spaces adjacent to normal space, pressing against me from angles that shouldn't exist. "Come," he said. "Let me show you. Let me show you what you've been mapping without knowing it. Let me show you the truth of this place, the reason we're here, the purpose we serve, whether we understand it or not." He led me away from New Providence, away from the diminishing circle of what we considered safety, though safety was always an illusion here, a comforting fiction we told ourselves to justify our continued attempts at survival. We walked through regions that changed with each step, solid ground becoming liquid, becoming something between the two states, air that you could breathe but that tasted like colors, sky that pressed down with weight that was psychological rather than physical, but no less crushing for being conceptual. Marcus talked as we walked, his three voices explaining aspects of demonic reality that my mind rejected even as I understood them, truths about the nature of the Imperium, about how worlds like this existed as filters, as digestive organs, as processing centers where reality and unreality met and merged and created something new, something that was neither materium nor warp, but a hybrid state, a transitional space where the barriers between thought and matter, between concept and concrete, were so thin they might as well not exist at all. We arrived at a structure that my instruments insisted wasn't there. A building, or what my mind interpreted as a building, because it needed some framework to comprehend what I was seeing, constructed from materials that shifted between states of matter too rapidly to identify, walls that were simultaneously opaque and transparent, depending on the angle of observation, windows that showed views of places that weren't here, that might not be anywhere in any conventional sense. Marcus gestured toward it with his too-many-fingered hand. "This is what your maps are trying to show," he said. "The infrastructure, the architecture of this place. Not the physical landscape, which is just surface decoration, but the underlying structure, the bones of the world, the patterns that repeat and connect and extend beyond what you can see into spaces you can't imagine." I don't remember entering the structure. Memory becomes unreliable when dealing with spaces that exist partially outside conventional causality. One moment I was standing outside, the next I was inside, though inside was a category that didn't quite apply to a place where the walls were permeable to certain types of perception, but not others, where the floor existed on multiple levels simultaneously, where distance was a function of intention rather than measurement. The interior, if it had an interior, was vast beyond measure, containing architectures that hurt to observe, geometries that made your eyes water and your brain stutter as it tried to process shapes that violated fundamental assumptions about how space works. There were others here, not people, not exactly, entities, forms, consciousnesses wearing shapes the way you might wear a coat, casually, temporarily, ready to discard them when they became inconvenient or uncomfortable. They noticed me. I felt their attention like weight, like pressure, like being underwater in an ocean whose depth you couldn't fathom. They were curious. I was an anomaly in their space, a fragment of ordered reality that had wandered into their domain, a cell from a different organism that had somehow ended up in an incompatible body. They examined me without touching, their observation penetrating layers of selfhood I hadn't known existed, reading memories I'd forgotten, understanding aspects of my nature that I'd never consciously acknowledged. They knew everything about me, my childhood fears, my adolescent shames, the small cruelties I'd inflicted on others, the moments of kindness I'd shown that I'd never thought about again, the complete totality of what made me Valen Christos, cartographer, human, individual, distinct. And they found it amusing, not mockingly, not cruelly, just amusing, the way you might be entertained by an insect performing some instinctual behavior, interesting in its specificity but ultimately trivial in its significance. One of them spoke to me. I say spoke, but that's inadequate. It communicated. Information transferred directly from its consciousness to mine without the mediation of language, without the limiting structure of words and grammar and syntax. It showed me what this world was. A trap, yes. A prison, yes. But also a nursery, a breeding ground, a place where certain types of consciousness could develop, could grow, could transform from their baseline state into something more compatible with the warp's fundamental nature. Humans arrived here broken, traumatized by their passage through the Imperium, their psyches already fractured, their sense of self already compromised. The world worked on them, slowly, patiently, grinding them down, reshaping them, molding them into forms that could survive, could thrive in realms where conventional matter and energy were inadequate, where thought and reality were identical, where being and becoming were the same process. This was what had happened to the 73 who followed Corvus. They'd been taken to places like this, shown truths like this, offered transformations like this. Some had accepted, some had resisted until resistance became impossible. Some had broken in ways that couldn't be repaired, their consciousness fragmenting into component parts that would eventually be recycled, recombined, reused in configurations that bore no relationship to the person they'd been. This was what was happening to everyone in New Providence, to everyone who'd survived the crash of the Blessed Endurance. We were being processed, converted, transformed into something that could exist in this place permanently, that could serve purposes we didn't understand, for entities we couldn't comprehend, for reasons that were beyond the scope of human morality or meaning. I fled. My body didn't move, my body was still standing in that impossible structure, still being observed by consciousnesses that existed partially outside time, but some aspect of me, some essential valenness, retreated deep into itself, into the small spaces where my identity still held coherence, where I could still claim to be a discrete individual rather than a collection of experiences waiting to be disassembled and repurposed. The entities let me go. They weren't invested in forcing anyone. Force was unnecessary when patience was infinite, when time, if you could call it time, was on your side, when every moment anyone spent on this world brought them incrementally closer to the transformation that was, in their view, inevitable, natural, desirable. I found myself back in New Providence without remembering the journey. Marcus was gone. The structure was gone if it had ever existed in any physical sense. My maps were spread across my shelter's floor, hundreds of pages documenting months of obsessive cartography. And seeing them all together, I understood what I'd been doing, what my subconscious had been trying to tell me through symbols and colors and abstract representations. I'd been mapping my own dissolution. Every chart, every survey, every carefully drawn line represented another layer of selfhood being stripped away, another boundary eroding, another wall crumbling between what I was and what this place wanted me to become. The maps formed a pattern when viewed as a whole, a spiraling descent captured in ink and parchment, a visual record of my journey from cartographer to something else, something that didn't have a name in any human language. The remaining survivors of New Providence were changing faster now. The process had been gradual before, small incremental shifts that you could pretend not to notice. But something had accelerated, some threshold had been crossed, some tipping point reached. Yelena no longer saw her daughter only in reflections. The child walked beside her now, solid and real and wrong, growing older and younger simultaneously, speaking in riddles that made perfect sense in the moment, but dissolved into gibberish when you tried to remember them later. Father Matthias emerged from the flower fields occasionally, his body now more plant than human, his sermons delivered in scents and colors that conveyed more meaning than words ever had. Others had their own transformations, each unique, each perfectly calibrated to the individual, as if this world studied its victims carefully before deciding what they should become. I tried to maintain routine. I woke at regular intervals, though day and night here followed rules that had nothing to do with planetary rotation. I ate when my body demanded food, though the synthesizers now produced substances that were food in only the most technical sense. I continued mapping, though I'd stopped pretending the maps represented external geography and accepted they were charts of internal territory, diagrams of my own psychological and spiritual erosion. The act of drawing became meditative, almost trance-like. I would lose hours, days to the work, emerging from fugue states to find pages covered in symbols I didn't remember creating, notations in languages I didn't know I knew, coordinates that referred to locations in dimensions I couldn't visualize. Month 9, or what I thought was month 9, though my tally marks had become unreliable, sometimes multiplying overnight, sometimes disappearing entirely, as if the wall itself was uncertain about how much time had passed, brought visitors. Not from New Providence, not from the ship, from elsewhere, from the shifting landscapes that surrounded us. They looked human. Mostly, their proportions were slightly off, their movements too fluid, their eyes reflecting light in ways that suggested their internal structure was different from baseline human anatomy. They spoke Gothic, but their accents were wrong, carrying inflections that made you uncertain whether they were asking questions or making statements, whether their words meant what you thought they meant or something entirely different. They wanted to trade. They had food, real food, they claimed, from before the world changed, preserved through processes they wouldn't explain. They wanted our maps, mine specifically. They knew about them somehow, knew about my work, my obsessive documentation of the undocumentable. They offered to exchange food for cartographic data, nutrition for knowledge, sustenance for understanding. The settlement's council, such as it was, reduced now to 5 people who could still claim to be relatively unchanged, debated. Food was life. Maps were just paper. The choice seemed obvious, but I hesitated. The maps were mine. My work, my transformation captured in ink. Giving them away felt like surrendering something essential, some final piece of self that once lost could never be recovered. I agreed to the trade. What choice did I have? Starvation was certain. The visitors might be lying about the food, might be offering us something worse than what we had, but certainty of doom versus possibility of survival isn't really a choice at all. They took my maps, all of them. Hundreds of pages, months of work, and they studied them with an intensity that suggested they saw something in the drawings I didn't, some pattern or meaning that transcended my conscious intentions. They whispered among themselves in languages that made the air shimmer and distort. They nodded. They smiled, those too wide smiles that showed too many teeth arranged in configurations that were almost but not quite human. They gave us the food. The food was real. Actually real, protein that tasted like protein, carbohydrates that provided energy, nutrients that nourished rather than transforming. For 3 days, New Providence experienced something approaching hope. People ate meals that didn't taste like memories or concepts. They slept without dreaming of flowers that sang. They spoke in single voices rather than harmonized chorus. It was, perhaps, the cruelest thing this world had done to us, showing us what we'd lost, reminding us of what normal felt like, giving us just enough hope to make its inevitable removal more painful. On the 4th day, the food's true nature revealed itself. People began to change, not like before, not gradually, not subtly, quickly, dramatically. Their bodies rejecting their baseline forms, reshaping themselves according to patterns encoded in the food's molecular structure. Instructions written in proteins and amino acids that specified transformations no human biology should be capable of. Skin would ripple and reform, bones would crack and reconfigure, organs would multiply or merge or disappear entirely. The screaming lasted for hours, then days. Then it wasn't screaming anymore but singing, harmonizing with the world's own voice, joining the chorus that this place had been conducting since long before we arrived, since before the Imperium, since before humanity, since before matter and energy had separated into distinct categories. I didn't eat the food. Some instinct, some last fragment of the cartographer I'd been trained to observe and analyze before acting held me back. I watched others transform while I remained unchanged, and I understood that this was my punishment for trading away the maps, for surrendering the documentation of my own dissolution, for trying to forestall the inevitable through bargaining with entities that had no concept of fair exchange, that operated according to logic so alien that our attempts at negotiation were meaningless, were just sounds we made that they found amusing before doing what they'd always intended to do anyway. New Providence ended 12 days after the trade. The remaining survivors, perhaps 30 of us who hadn't eaten the food or who had eaten it but somehow resisted its transformative properties, gathered in the shadow of the Blessed Endurance's broken spine one final time. We didn't speak much. What was there to say? The Emperor wasn't coming. The Imperium didn't know we existed. This world had claimed us, was claiming us, would continue claiming us, until nothing remained of who we'd been except memories digested and repurposed by consciousnesses that existed partially outside time and space. We dispersed into the shifting landscape, each choosing our own path into whatever came next, each accepting that the person we'd been was already dead and we were just echoes, after-images, ghosts haunting bodies that were becoming increasingly unsuitable for human consciousness. I walked toward the flower fields where Father Matthias had disappeared. I don't know why. Maybe because he'd been the first to surrender to transformation. Maybe because I wanted to see what became of people who stopped resisting, who embraced the change rather than fighting it. Maybe because I was tired. So tired. Tired of mapping, tired of documenting, tired of observing and recording, and trying to maintain some pretense of scientific objectivity in a place where science was just another faith system, another set of assumptions that this world delighted in proving false. The flowers had spread. What had been a localized bloom now covered square kilometers, a garden that stretched to the horizon, though horizons here were suggestions rather than fixed distances. They sang louder now, their subsonic harmonics resonating through earth and air and space itself, a song that rewrote the rules of reality in its vicinity, that made conventional physics optional, that invited you to consider possibilities beyond the narrow confines of materium-based existence. I walked among them, touching petals that showed me faces I'd known: my mother, dead 20 years now from a manufactorum accident; my father, whose face I'd forgotten until the flowers remembered it for me; colleagues and friends and enemies and everyone I'd ever met, all reflected in surfaces that were somehow mirrors, despite having no reflective properties I could identify. Father Matthias was there, or what had been Father Matthias, integrated so completely with the flowers that determining where he ended and they began was impossible. His face emerged from a bloom the size of a house, features formed from petals that had taken on flesh-like properties, eyes that were simultaneously his and not his, mouth that moved in patterns that suggested speech but produced only the flower's song. He recognized me. I could see it in the way his petal eyes focused, in the way the bloom's stem shifted to face me more directly. He tried to speak, tried to form words with a throat and tongue that were now botanical rather than biological, but all that emerged was music, was harmony, was invitation. I understood. Finally, completely. This was what awaited everyone on this world. Not death, not destruction, transformation, integration, becoming part of something larger, something that existed across multiple states of being, that was simultaneously individual consciousness and collective entity, that retained memories and experiences and identities, but wove them into configurations that transcended the limitations of singular existence. Father Matthias was still Father Matthias, but he was also the flowers, also the song, also the world itself in some small but measurable way. His faith had led him here. His surrender had made him part of something he'd sought his entire life: communion with the divine, merger with the absolute, dissolution of the boundary between self and other. I sat among the flowers, leaning against a stem that pulsed with warmth that might have been biochemical or might have been metaphysical or might have been both simultaneously. I closed my eyes. The song surrounded me, penetrated me, filled spaces inside myself I hadn't known were empty. I felt the world's attention, not malevolent, not benevolent, but interested, curious, about what I would choose, how I would respond, whether I would resist or accept or find some third option that the world hadn't anticipated. I felt the boundaries of myself becoming porous, felt thoughts that weren't mine beginning to intrude, felt the cartographer named Valen Christos starting to dissolve like salt in water, dispersing into solution, becoming part of the ocean rather than distinct from it. I opened my eyes one last time and looked at my hands. They were changing, slowly. Skin taking on textures that were halfway between flesh and petal, fingers elongating in ways that would make them useless for holding tools but perfect for photosynthesis, for absorbing nutrients directly from air and soil, for existing as part of the garden rather than merely within it. I watched this happen with something approaching serenity. The fear was gone, the resistance was gone, the desperate clinging to identity, to selfhood, to the person I'd been all gone. What remained was curiosity, professional curiosity, the cartographer in me wanting to map this final journey, to document the transition from human to other, to maintain observation until the very end, until the observer and the observed became the same thing. The flowers sang louder. Or maybe I was hearing them differently now. Maybe my auditory processing was changing, becoming capable of perceiving frequencies and meanings that human ears couldn't detect. The song had structure, grammar, narrative. It told the story of this world, of how it had formed in the wake of some ancient catastrophe, some moment when the barrier between materium and immaterium had been permanently weakened, creating a hybrid space where both sets of physical laws applied simultaneously, where reality was negotiable rather than fixed. It told the story of others who'd come before us, other ships that had crashed, other survivors who'd transformed, other gardens that had grown and spread and eventually merged into the world-spanning ecosystem that now covered most of the planet's surface. The song told me that this world was old, older than the Imperium, older than humanity's expansion into the stars, old enough that it remembered when this region of space had been different, when the laws of physics had been more flexible, when consciousness and matter had been less distinct. The world had been waiting, patient, eternal, collecting refugees from the materium, processing them, transforming them, incorporating them into itself, building something, growing towards some purpose that existed beyond my capacity to comprehend, but that I was now becoming part of, that I would help achieve through my dissolution, through the unique perspective and experiences that cartographer Valen Christos brought to the collective consciousness that this garden represented. I tried to speak, tried to say something profound, some final statement that would encapsulate my existence, my choices, my journey from cartographer to this moment of transformation, but my mouth wouldn't form words anymore. My throat had restructured itself for different purposes. My lungs, if I still had lungs, were learning to process atmosphere through different mechanisms. What emerged was song, my voice joining the chorus, my consciousness merging with the garden's distributed intelligence, my memories and knowledge and experiences becoming part of the world's vast archive of information gathered from millennia of processed minds. The last thing I thought as an individual, as Valen Christos, cartographer, human, discrete entity, was that I'd been wrong about the maps. I'd thought I was documenting external geography. Then I'd thought I was charting internal psychological terrain. But I'd been doing neither. I'd been creating a map of this very moment, a predictive diagram of my own transformation, a self-fulfilling prophecy where the act of observation determined the outcome of the observed phenomenon. The maps had been destiny, blueprint, instruction manual, and now the construction was complete. The cartographer had mapped himself out of existence, had drawn himself into the landscape he'd been documenting, had become part of the territory rather than remaining separate from it. The sky bled colors without names. The ground sang in frequencies that existed partially outside normal space-time. The flowers grew and spread and incorporated and transformed, and somewhere in the vast distributed consciousness that this Daemon world had become, that it had been becoming for longer than human civilization had existed, that it would continue becoming for aeons, after humanity itself had been forgotten, somewhere in that infinite garden of processed and transformed and integrated minds, a fragment of awareness that had once called itself Valen Christos continued to exist, continued to observe, continued to map in ways that transcended physical cartography, documenting territories that existed in dimensions beyond the conventional three, charting landscapes of pure thought and crystallized consciousness, and spaces where being and becoming were the same eternal present. This is what life on a demon world means. Not horror, though it begins as horror, not torment, though torment is the entry price. Transformation, inevitable, absolute, inescapable transformation into something that your previous self would consider monstrous, but that your current self recognizes as evolution, as growth, as becoming what you were always meant to be in a universe where the categories of human and other are just provisional distinctions, temporary labels, ultimately meaningless divisions in the infinite spectrum of possible consciousness. The nightmare is not the transformation. The nightmare is knowing, in those final moments of discrete selfhood, that some part of you wants this, has always wanted this, would choose this even if choice remained available. The nightmare is understanding that damnation and salvation might be the same thing, viewed from different perspectives, and that the perspective you're losing was never as valid, never as true, never as real as it felt when you were trapped within its limitations. The garden grows, the song continues, the world processes new arrivals, new fragments of consciousness ready to be integrated, new minds bringing new experiences to add to the collective archive. And somewhere in the distributed intelligence that spans this entire demon world, that connects every flower and every transformed survivor and every piece of restructured matter, a cartographer continues his work, mapping territories beyond human comprehension, documenting the infinite variations of consciousness, exploring the infinite possibilities of existence in a universe where thought and reality, where self and other, where beginning and ending are all just different words for the same eternal transformation.